Your alarm clock is the crack of a foreman's whip. Your breakfast is a handful of onions and stale bread. Your office is 450 feet of unforgiving limestone under a merciless sun. Welcome to the daily life of an ancient Egyptian pyramid worker, where every sunrise brought fresh agony and every sunset was a small miracle. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The darkness before dawn in the workers' village was never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours of night, the settlement hummed with the sounds of restless sleep. Men coughing from lungs clogged with limestone dust, the groans of bodies too broken to find comfort, and the occasional cry from someone reliving the day's horrors in their dreams. But it was the rhythmic thudding that announced the coming of another day. The sound that would drag thousands of men from whatever peace they had managed to find in sleep. Kheti felt the vibration through the packed earth floor of his shelter before he heard the sound. The foreman's staff, thick as a man's wrist and hardened by years of use, struck the ground in a pattern that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. 3 sharp strikes, pause, 3 more. The wake-up call that meant another day of moving stones that could crush a man's spine. Another day of surviving in the shadow of the growing pyramid. His eyes opened to complete darkness, but Kheti knew exactly where he was. In a mud brick shelter barely larger than a man lying down. Sharing the cramped space with 5 other workers, the air was thick and stifling, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer and the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in the workers' village. Someone near his feet was already stirring. Probably Amenhotep, who always woke at the first sound. The man had learned, like they all had, that those who moved quickly in the morning avoided the worst of the foreman's wrath. The thudding grew louder, accompanied now by shouting voices as the shift supervisors made their way through the maze of workers' quarters. Up! Up! The sun waits for no man, and neither does the pyramid. The words were always the same, delivered in the harsh dialect of the construction overseers. Men who had climbed from the ranks of workers themselves and now drove their former equals with the fervor of the convert. Kheti rolled onto his side, feeling the familiar protest from his lower back, a constant ache that had become his companion over the 3 seasons he had been working on the Great Pyramid. 3 seasons of hauling stone. 3 seasons of feeling his body slowly breaking down under the relentless demands of construction. He was 25 years old, an age when men in the villages along the Nile might be thinking of taking a second wife or expanding their farms. Instead, he felt like he was carrying the weight of 50 years on his shoulders. The shelter erupted into motion as the 6 men began the daily ritual of preparation. There was no conversation. Talking took energy they couldn't spare. And besides, what was there to say? They all knew what lay ahead. Another day of moving limestone blocks that weighed as much as several men combined. Another day of racing against the sun and the foreman's whips. Another day of hoping that they would see the evening meal. Kheti groped in the darkness for his possessions, such as they were. A water skin made from goat hide, cracked and patched but still functional. A wooden bowl, carved roughly and stained with years of use. A small knife, its edge worn from constant sharpening, useful for cutting food and little else. And most importantly, the leather padding that he wrapped around his shoulders and back, makeshift protection against the ropes and straps they used to drag the massive stones. The padding had been his own innovation, born from painful experience. In his first weeks at the construction site, He had worked without any protection, following the example of the other men who seemed to take pride in their ability to endure pain. But Kheti had quickly learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ropes that connected the workers to the stone sleds cut through skin and muscle with the efficiency of knives. Men who refused to protect themselves often found themselves unable to work within days, their backs and shoulders raw and infected. Outside their shelter, the workers' village was coming to life with the organized chaos that marked the beginning of each working day. Thousands of men were emerging from similar cramped quarters, each one going through the same routine of gathering their few possessions and preparing for another day of labor. The village itself was a marvel of efficiency, if not comfort. Row upon row of identical mud brick structures laid out in a grid that allowed the overseers to move quickly through the settlement and account for every worker. The air was already warming, even though true dawn was still an hour away. The desert heat began building before the sun even appeared, and by the time the workday was in full swing, the temperature would climb to levels that made breathing an effort and turned metal tools too hot to touch with bare skin. But for now, in the pre-dawn darkness, there was almost a coolness to the air, the last gift of the night before the sun reclaimed its dominion over the land. Kheti stepped outside and immediately fell into line with the stream of workers moving toward the communal eating area. The organization was rigid. Each gang of workers had their assigned time to collect their morning ration, and woe to man who missed his window. The overseers didn't accept excuses, and a missed meal meant working a full day on an empty stomach, something that could easily prove fatal under the brutal conditions of the construction site. The morning ration was always the same: a portion of bread, baked the previous evening and already beginning to harden in the dry air, a handful of onions, which helped prevent disease and gave some energy for the work ahead, and occasionally a small piece of dried fish or meat, though this was reserved for the workers who had performed particularly well the previous day or who held slightly higher positions in the construction hierarchy. As Kheti waited in line, he could see the first hints of light beginning to appear on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange. The pyramid itself was visible as a massive silhouette against the lightening sky, its incomplete form already towering above everything else in the landscape. 3 seasons of work, and it seemed to Kheti that they had barely made a dent in the massive project. The base was complete, a perfect square covering more than 13 acres, and the first several levels of stone had been laid with mathematical precision that spoke to the genius of the architects and engineers who had designed the structure. But looking at it in the early morning light, Kheti was struck, not by the accomplishment, but by the sheer magnitude of what remained to be done. Thousands upon thousands of stone blocks still needed to be quarried, transported, and lifted into place. Each block represented hours of back-breaking labor, and there were so many blocks that Kheti had given up trying to count them. The project would take decades to complete, and many of the men currently working on it would never live to see its completion. The line moved forward, and Kheti found himself face to face with one of the food distributors, a thick-set man with arms like tree trunks and a perpetual scowl that suggested he had little patience for delays. The man handed over the standard ration without a word, his attention already moving to the next worker in line. Kheti tucked the bread into his belt and bit into one of the onions, feeling the sharp bite of the vegetable wake up his senses and clear his head. Around him, the village continued its transformation from sleeping settlement to organized workforce. Gang leaders were calling out the names of their workers, taking attendance and making note of anyone who was too sick or injured to work. The missing men would be replaced by others from the reserve pool, farmers and laborers from up and down the Nile who had come to work on the pyramid during the flood season when their own fields are underwater and there was no agricultural work to be done. This seasonal workforce was the backbone of the pyramid construction project. During the months when the Nile flooded the farmland, making agriculture impossible, thousands of men would make the journey to the pyramid site, drawn by the promise of steady food and the small payment that came at the end of each season. It wasn't much, perhaps enough to buy a new tool or some luxury items for their families, but it was better than sitting idle while the floodwaters slowly receded. Kheti had been part of this seasonal migration for 3 years now, and he had seen how the work changed men. The farmers who arrived in their first season were usually strong and healthy, their bodies conditioned by years of physical work. But the pyramid construction was different from farming. More intense, more dangerous, and far more demanding on the human body. By their second season, most men showed the signs of wear. The slight stoop in the shoulders from hauling heavy loads, the careful way they moved to protect injured backs and joints, the hollow look around the eyes that came from chronic exhaustion. Those who returned for a third season, like Kheti, were the survivors. Men whose bodies had somehow adapted to the brutal demands of the work, or who had learned enough about the construction process to avoid the worst of the dangers. But even the survivors paid a price. Kheti could feel it in his own body, the stiffness that never quite went away, the shortness of breath that came from lungs damaged by limestone dust, the way his hands shook slightly when he was tired, a tremor that hadn't been there when he first arrived at the pyramid site. The eastern sky was growing lighter now, and the pace of activity in the village was increasing. The morning meal was just the first step in a carefully orchestrated routine that would see thousands of workers organized, equipped, and deployed to their various tasks across the construction site. Some would work in the quarries, cutting and shaping the limestone blocks that formed the body of the pyramid. Others would be assigned to the transport teams, the men who moved the finished blocks from the quarries to the construction site using a combination of sledges, ramps, and sheer human muscle power. Still others would work on the pyramid itself, fitting the massive blocks into place with a precision that amazed even the workers themselves. These were the elite workers, the men who had demonstrated not just strength and endurance but also the skill and judgment necessary to position multi-ton blocks of stone with the accuracy demanded by the pyramid's design. Kheti aspired to join their ranks someday, but he knew that such positions were earned through years of experience and countless demonstrations of reliability. For now, he was part of the transport teams, and he knew that his day would be spent hauling stone across the desert sand under the merciless Egyptian sun. It was hard work, dangerous work, and work that claimed its share of casualties with each passing day. But it was also work that paid, work that fed him, and work that connected him, however distantly, to one of the greatest construction projects in human history. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep over the horizon, Kheti finished his meager breakfast and prepared to join the thousands of other workers making their way toward another day of labor. The pyramid waited, silent and massive against the morning sky, ready to claim another day of human effort in its slow climb toward completion. The workers' village stretched across the desert like a vast grid of human misery, organized with the same mathematical precision that governed the pyramid's construction. From above, it might have appeared orderly, even impressive. Thousands of mud brick structures arranged in neat rows, connected by carefully planned pathways that allowed for efficient movement of people and supplies. But at ground level, where the workers lived and suffered and died, the reality was far different. Kheti's shelter was typical of the workers' quarters. A rectangular structure barely 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, with walls made from mud bricks that had been baked in the desert sun until they were hard as stone. The roof was a simple affair of wooden beams covered with palm fronds and more mud, designed to provide basic protection from the elements, but little in the way of comfort. There were no windows, just a single doorway that could be covered with a piece of coarse cloth during sandstorms or when privacy was desperately needed. 6 men shared this cramped space, sleeping on mats woven from reeds and whatever scraps of cloth they could gather. Personal possessions were kept to an absolute minimum. There simply wasn't room for anything beyond the most essential tools and clothing. The hierarchy of sleeping arrangements, was determined by a combination of seniority, physical strength, and the complex social dynamics that governed life among the workers. The newest arrivals slept closest to the door, where they were most likely to be disturbed by the comings and goings of their sheltermates, and where the morning wake-up calls hit with maximum force. The village housed roughly 20,000 workers during peak construction seasons, making it one of the largest settlements in Egypt outside of the major cities along the Nile. But unlike those cities which had developed organically over generations, the workers' village had been built specifically for the pyramid project, designed with efficiency rather than livability as its primary concern. Every aspect of the settlement reflected this priority, from the narrow pathways that forced workers to move in single file, to the communal facilities that processed thousands of men with assembly line efficiency. Water was perhaps the most precious commodity in the village, and its distribution was governed by strict rules that reflected the harsh realities of desert life. The main water supply came from wells that had been dug at enormous expense, tapping into underground sources that lay far beneath the desert surface. This water was carefully rationed, with each worker receiving a fixed allocation that had to serve for drinking, cooking, and what little washing was possible. Additional water could sometimes be obtained through trade or by performing extra duties, but for most workers the daily ration represented the absolute limit of what was available. The quality of the water varied considerably depending on the season and the condition of the wells. During the best times it was merely warm and slightly brackish, with a mineral taste that took some getting used to. During the worst times, when the wells were running low or when one of the pumping systems had broken down, the water could be muddy, foul-tasting, and sometimes dangerous to drink. Workers learned to let their water sit in clay vessels, allowing the sediment to settle before carefully pouring off the cleaner liquid from the top. Hygiene in the workers' village was a constant challenge that most men eventually gave up trying to solve. The lack of adequate water, combined with the harsh conditions and the physical demands of the work, made it virtually impossible to stay clean by any reasonable standard. Most workers developed a thick layer of dust, sweat, and grime that became like a second skin, protecting them from the sun and wind, but also marking them unmistakably as laborers from the pyramid site. The more experienced workers had learned various tricks for maintaining some semblance of cleanliness. Sand could be used to scrub away the worst of the accumulated dirt and oil, though it left the skin raw and sometimes bleeding. Some men saved small portions of their fat rations to use as a crude soap, though this meant sacrificing precious calories that their bodies desperately needed. Others had learned to identify plants in the surrounding desert that could be used for cleaning, though these were rare and jealously guarded by those who knew their locations. Disease was a constant presence in the workers' village, spreading rapidly through the cramped quarters and poor sanitary conditions. Dysentery was perhaps the most common ailment, claiming workers with such regularity that the overseers had learned to factor a certain percentage of sick days into their planning. The disease could strike suddenly and progress rapidly, turning a healthy worker into a shrunken, dehydrated shell within a matter of days. Those who survived often found themselves weakened for weeks or months afterward, struggling to regain the strength necessary for heavy labor. Respiratory problems were equally common, caused by the constant inhalation of limestone dust that permeated every aspect of life at the construction site. The dust got into everything: food, water, bedding, clothing, creating a persistent irritation that gradually damaged the lungs and throat. Workers developed a characteristic cough that started as a minor irritation but often progressed to violent fits that could last for hours. In severe cases, men would cough up blood, a sign that their lungs were being permanently damaged by the abrasive particles they breathed every day. Injuries were treated with whatever remedies were available, which often meant no treatment at all. The village had a few men who served as healers, workers who had picked up some knowledge of medicine through experience or training in their home villages. These men did what they could with the limited supplies available, setting broken bones with wooden splints, treating cuts with honey or tree resin, and providing herbal remedies for various ailments. But their knowledge was limited, and their supplies were scarce, leaving many workers to heal as best they could or to suffer with chronic pain and disability. The social structure of the workers' village reflected the broader hierarchy of Egyptian society, but with important modifications dictated by the unique conditions of the construction project. At the bottom were the newest arrivals, men who had never worked on a major construction project, and who had to prove themselves before being trusted with important tasks. These men were assigned the most dangerous and exhausting work, and they suffered the highest rates of injury and death. Above them were the experienced seasonal workers, like Kheti, men who had returned for multiple construction seasons and had demonstrated their ability to survive and contribute to the project. These workers were given slightly better accommodations and more varied work assignments, though they were still subject to the same harsh conditions and brutal demands as everyone else. At the top of the worker hierarchy were the permanent residents, men who had made the pyramid construction their life's work and who lived at the site year-round. These included skilled craftsmen, gang leaders and technical specialists whose expertise was essential to the project's success. They enjoyed better housing, more varied food, and some protection from the worst abuses of the system. But they also carried the burden of responsibility for the project's progress and quality. The gang system was the basic organizational unit of the workforce, with each gang consisting of roughly 20 men under the leadership of an experienced worker who had proven his ability to manage both people and tasks. Gang leaders were responsible for maintaining discipline, ensuring that work quotas were met, and dealing with problems that arose among their workers. It was a position that carried both privilege and danger. Gang leaders who failed to meet expectations could quickly find themselves demoted back to the ranks of ordinary laborers, while those who succeeded might eventually move up to positions of greater authority and responsibility. Competition between gangs was encouraged by the overseers, who understood that rivalry could be a powerful motivator in driving productivity. Each gang was assigned specific tasks and quotas, and their performance was tracked and compared with that of other gangs. The most successful gangs received better food rations, preferred work assignments, and various small privileges that made life marginally more bearable. The worst performing gangs found themselves assigned to the most dangerous and exhausting tasks, creating a powerful incentive for workers to push themselves and their gangmates to maximum effort. Food distribution in the workers' village was governed by a complex system that reflected both the practical challenges of feeding 20,000 people and the social hierarchies that structured life at the construction site. The basic ration was the same for all workers: bread, onions, and beer, with occasional supplements of dried fish, meat, or vegetables depending on availability and the workers' performance. But within this seemingly egalitarian system, there were countless opportunities for variation and inequality. The quality of the bread, for example, varied considerably depending on when it was baked and how it was stored. Workers who received their rations early in the distribution cycle got fresher, softer bread, while those who came later often found themselves with hard, stale loaves that were difficult to chew and digest. The onions might be fresh and crisp or old and starting to rot, and the beer could range from reasonably palatable to bitter and sour, depending on how long it had been sitting in the sun. Gang leaders and other privileged workers often received additional rations or access to higher quality food, while those who had fallen out of favor with the overseers might find their portions reduced or of inferior quality. The food distributors, who controlled this crucial resource, wielded considerable power within the village hierarchy, and were both feared and courted by workers seeking to improve their circumstances. The evening meal was the main social event of the day, when workers gathered in small groups to share their food and whatever news or gossip had accumulated during the day's work. These gatherings served important functions beyond mere sustenance. They provided opportunities to form alliances, share information about working conditions and opportunities, and maintain some sense of human connection in an environment that often seemed designed to reduce men to mere units of labor. Conversations during these meals revealed the diverse backgrounds of the workers and the various circumstances that had brought them to the pyramid site. Some were farmers whose fields had been destroyed by floods or drought, forcing them to seek work elsewhere to support their families. Others were craftsmen whose skills were in demand for the construction project, men who had been recruited specifically for their expertise in stoneworking, metalworking, or other specialized trades. Still others were there as a form of taxation or corvée labor, fulfilling obligations to the state that were part of the social contract that bound subjects to their pharaoh. These men often resented their presence at the construction site and worked only as hard as necessary to avoid punishment, counting the days until they could return to their normal lives. Their attitude was understandable but also dangerous, as lack of attention or effort in such a hazardous environment could lead to injury or death, not just for themselves but for their fellow workers. The village also housed a significant number of permanent residents, whose jobs were essential to the smooth operation of the construction project. These included cooks, water carriers, toolmakers, and various other specialists, whose skills kept the workforce fed, equipped, and functioning. Many of these workers had families, creating a small but stable community within the larger transient population of seasonal laborers. The presence of families added another layer of complexity to life in the workers' village. Children played among the mud brick structures, somehow managing to find joy and entertainment in an environment that seemed to offer little of either. Women worked in food preparation, textile production, and various other tasks that supported the construction effort, though their numbers were small compared to the overwhelmingly male workforce. As night fell over the workers' village, the sounds and smells that define daily life gradually gave way to a different set of sensations. The temperature dropped significantly once the sun disappeared, providing blessed relief from the brutal heat that dominated the daylight hours. Cook fires flickered throughout the settlement as workers prepared their evening meals, creating pockets of warmth and light in the growing darkness. The air filled with the sounds of thousands of exhausted men settling down for the night, conversations gradually dying away, the rustle of reed mats being arranged for sleeping, the occasional cough or groan from someone whose body was protesting the day's abuse. In the distance, the incomplete pyramid loomed as a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, a constant reminder of the purpose that drove everything in the workers' village. Sleep, when it finally came, was often restless and interrupted. The cramped quarters made it difficult to find a comfortable position, and the sounds and movements of sheltermates frequently disturbed what rest was possible. Many workers suffered from chronic pain that made sleep elusive, while others were kept awake by anxiety about the next day's work or worry about families left behind in distant villages. But despite the hardships and discomforts, the workers' village represented something remarkable in human history. A community of unprecedented size and organization dedicated to a single massive construction project that would outlast all of its builders by thousands of years. The men who lived and suffered in these mud brick shelters were participating in something far greater than themselves, though few of them probably saw it that way as they tried to find sleep on their reed mats, preparing for another day of back-breaking labor under the Egyptian sun. The signal to begin the march came while the eastern horizon was still painted in the deep purples and oranges of pre-dawn, delivered by the harsh blast of ram's horns that echoed across the workers' village like the call of some prehistoric beast. The sound cut through the morning air with an urgency that brooked no delay, and within moments the entire settlement was in motion as 20,000 men began the daily transformation from sleeping laborers to organized workforce. And Kheti rolled up his sleeping mat with practiced efficiency, stuffing it into the corner of the shelter where it would wait for his return that evening. Assuming he survived another day at the construction site, Around him, his 5 sheltermates were going through the same routine, each man gathering his few possessions and preparing for the march that would take them from the relative safety of the workers' village to the dangerous chaos of the pyramid construction site. The organization of this daily exodus was a marvel of logistics that rivaled anything in the ancient world. 20,000 workers had to be assembled, counted, equipped, and transported to their various work sites across a construction zone that sprawled across hundreds of acres of desert. The process had been refined over years of construction, honed into a system that could move vast numbers of people with military precision, while accounting for the countless variables that could disrupt the smooth operation of such a massive undertaking. Gang leaders moved through the village with the authority of field commanders, calling out the names of their workers and checking each man for signs of illness or injury that might affect his ability to work. Those who were deemed unfit for labor were sent to a separate area where they would either be assigned to lighter duties or, in severe cases, left behind to recover while substitute workers took their places. The gang leaders carried wooden tablets covered with wax on which they recorded attendance and made notes about their workers' condition and performance. Kheti fell into line with his gang as they made their way toward the central assembly area, a large open space at the heart of the workers' village where the various gangs gathered before beginning their march to the construction site. The organization was based on a hierarchy of work assignments that reflected both the skill level required for different tasks and the dangerous nature of pyramid construction. At the head of the procession were the skilled craftsmen and specialists, the stonemasons who would shape and fit the massive limestone blocks, the engineers who supervised the complex process of moving and positioning multi-ton pieces of stone, and the surveyors who ensured that the pyramid's geometry remained precise as it climbed toward the sky. These men enjoyed higher status and better treatment than the ordinary laborers, but they also carried greater responsibility for the project's success and faced severe punishment if their work was found wanting. Behind them came the transport gangs, the workers like Kheti, whose job was to move the finished limestone blocks from the quarries to the construction site. This was perhaps the most physically demanding work on the entire project, requiring enormous strength and endurance as teams of men dragged sledges loaded with stones that could weigh several tons across the rough desert terrain. The transport workers were organized into crews of 20 to 30 men, each crew responsible for moving a specific number of blocks during the course of the working day. The tool distribution process began as the gangs assembled, with supervisors moving through the ranks and handing out the implements that would be needed for the day's work. For the transport crews, this meant thick ropes made from twisted papyrus and palm fibers, wooden levers for adjusting the position of heavy loads, and leather padding to protect their bodies from the cutting edges of the ropes. The tools were precious resources that had to be carefully maintained and accounted for. A lost rope or broken lever could bring an entire work crew to a halt until a replacement could be found. Kheti accepted his assigned rope with the automatic gesture of someone who had performed the same action hundreds of times before. The rope was thick as a man's wrist and rough to the touch, woven from fibers that had been rooted with oils and resins to increase their strength and durability. Even so, the ropes were subject to enormous stress during the course of a working day and had to be regularly inspected and replaced when they showed signs of weakness or wear. The leather padding that protected the workers' bodies from the ropes was equally important, though it was often in short supply and had to be shared among multiple workers. The padding consisted of strips of thick leather that were tied around the shoulders, back, and waist, creating a crude but effective barrier between the worker's skin and the cutting edge of the rope. New workers often neglected this protection, thinking that they could tough out the pain, but they quickly learned that working without padding led to cuts and abrasions that could become infected and incapacitating. As the sun began to rise above the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, the assembled workforce began to move. The march to the construction site was carefully choreographed, with different gangs following predetermined routes, that prevented bottlenecks and ensured that workers arrived at their assigned locations in an orderly fashion. The routes had been laid out by engineers who understood both the terrain and the logistics of moving large numbers of people efficiently across difficult ground. The path from the workers' village to the main construction site was roughly 2 miles long, winding through the desert in a series of gentle curves that avoided the worst of the rocky outcroppings and soft sand that could slow the march. Along the way, the workers passed various support facilities that had been constructed to serve the pyramid project, storage areas for tools and materials, workshops where specialized equipment was manufactured and repaired, and smaller pyramids and tombs for nobles and officials who wanted to be buried near the pharaoh's monument. The early morning air was still relatively cool, providing a brief respite from the heat that would soon become unbearable. Kheti walked with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for the long day ahead, knowing that the march to the construction site was just the beginning of his physical ordeal. Around him, the other workers maintained the same steady rhythm, their faces already showing the resignation and determination that marked men who had learned to endure suffering as a normal part of their daily existence. Conversation during the march was limited, but revealing, consisting mainly of practical information about the day's work assignments and gossip about conditions at various work sites. The workers had developed an informal communication network that allowed information to flow quickly through the ranks, warning of dangerous conditions, identifying supervisors who were particularly harsh or lenient, and sharing news about injuries or deaths that had occurred during previous days. The pyramid itself became visible as a massive silhouette against the morning sky as the workers crested a small rise about halfway through their march. Even after 3 seasons of working on the project, Kheti still felt a sense of awe when he saw the monument rising from the desert floor, its precise geometric form a stark contrast to the irregular landscape around it. The pyramid was already enormous, its base covering more than 13 acres and its partially completed height towering above everything else in the region. But the sight that dominated the landscape was not just the pyramid itself, but the incredible complexity of the construction site that surrounded it. Ramps spiraled around the monument's growing height, providing pathways for the workers who were positioning stones at the upper levels. Temporary structures dotted the area, workshops, storage facilities, and work platforms that supported the various specialized tasks involved in pyramid construction. The scale of human activity was staggering. Thousands of workers were already at their positions, having begun their work before dawn to take advantage of the cooler morning air. Stonemasons were shaping blocks with copper chisels and wooden mallets, their rhythmic hammering creating a constant percussion that echoed across the construction site. Transport crews were dragging loaded sledges up the ramps, their progress marked by the shouts of gang leaders and the groaning protests of rope and wood under enormous strain. As Kheti's gang approached their assigned work area, they could see the limestone blocks that awaited them. Massive rectangles of stone that had been quarried from nearby deposits and roughly shaped by skilled craftsmen. Each block represented hours of careful work by stonemasons, who had learned to split and shape limestone with a precision that was essential to the pyramid's construction. The blocks had to fit together with almost perfect accuracy, leaving minimal gaps that could compromise the structural integrity of the finished monument. The sledges that would transport these blocks were marvels of engineering in their own right, constructed from heavy timbers that had been carefully selected and shaped to bear enormous loads. The runners were coated with a mixture of animal fat and sand that reduced friction and allowed the sledges to slide more easily across the ground. Though even with this assistance, moving a loaded sledge required the coordinated effort of an entire work crew. The process of loading a block onto a sledge was dangerous and required careful coordination among all members of the transport crew. Wooden levers were used to lift one edge of the stone, while wooden rollers were positioned underneath, allowing the block to be gradually worked onto the sledge bed. The slightest mistake during this process could result in a multi-ton stone crushing, whoever was unfortunate enough to be in its path, making this one of the most feared aspects of transport work. Kheti had seen men die during loading operations, usually when someone made a careless move or when a piece of equipment failed under the enormous stress. The deaths were quick but horrifying, and they served as constant reminders of the dangers that lurked in every aspect of pyramid construction. The supervisors were quick to clear away the bodies and get the work crews back to their tasks, knowing that dwelling on such incidents could lead to panic and work stoppages that would disrupt the carefully planned construction schedule. Once a block was successfully loaded onto a sledge, the transport crew had to organize themselves for the difficult journey to the pyramid itself. The crew would arrange themselves around the sledge with some men positioned at the front to pull on the main rope while others took positions along the sides to help guide the heavy load and prevent it from veering off course. The most experienced workers were typically assigned to the key positions, while newer men were placed in supporting roles where their inexperience was less likely to cause problems. The rope work was both an art and a science, requiring precise coordination among all members of the crew. The main pulling rope was attached to the front of the sledge and distributed among multiple workers to spread the load, while additional ropes were used to control the sledge's direction and prevent it from gaining too much momentum on downhill sections. The workers had to move in perfect synchronization, responding instantly to commands from their gang leader and adjusting their efforts based on the terrain and conditions. The supervisors who oversaw the transport operations were drawn from the ranks of experienced workers who had demonstrated both technical skill and leadership ability. These men carried the authority to assign work crews to specific tasks, discipline workers who failed to meet expectations, and make decisions about work methods and safety procedures. They were also responsible for maintaining the brutal pace of work that was necessary to meet the construction deadlines imposed by the pharaoh and his administrators. The supervision system was designed to extract maximum productivity from the workforce, while maintaining enough discipline to prevent accidents and work stoppages. Supervisors carried wooden staffs that served both as symbols of their authority and as instruments of punishment for workers who failed to meet expectations. The threat of physical punishment was constant and real, though the supervisors were careful not to damage workers so severely that they couldn't continue working. As the morning progressed and the temperature began to rise, the construction site took on the character of a vast outdoor factory, where thousands of workers labored in carefully coordinated teams to move massive amounts of stone. The noise was overwhelming. The sound of hammers on stone, the creaking of ropes under strain, the shouts of supervisors and gang leaders, and the constant background murmur of 20,000 people engaged in hard physical labor. The air began to shimmer with heat waves as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Kheti could feel the sweat starting to form on his body despite the early hour. The leather padding that protected him from the ropes was already beginning to feel uncomfortable, and he knew that by midday it would be soaked with perspiration and chafing against his skin. But there was no alternative. Working without protection would lead to injuries that could end his career as a transport worker and leave him dependent on whatever charity he could find in the workers' village. The first transport run of the day was about to begin, and Kheti took his position along the main pulling rope, feeling the familiar weight of the leather harness settling across his shoulders. Around him, his crewmates were making their final preparations, checking their equipment and positioning themselves for the coordinated effort that would be required to move their assigned block from the quarry area to the pyramid construction site. The gang leader raised his staff to signal the beginning of the pull, and Kheti tensed his muscles in preparation for the enormous effort that lay ahead. This was the moment when the careful organization and preparation of the morning would be put to the test, when human muscle and determination would be pitted against the immutable laws of physics in an effort to move stones that seemed to belong to the realm of the gods rather than the world of mortal men. The gang leader's staff came down with a sharp crack against the hard-packed earth, and 28 men threw their combined weight against ropes that connected them to 4 tons of limestone. The initial resistance was always the worst, The moment when the full weight of the stone seemed to press back against their efforts. When the sledge runners bit deep into the sand and gravel. When every muscle in their bodies had to overcome the fundamental reluctance of matter to move. Kheti felt the rope cut into his shoulders, despite the leather padding. The rough fibers finding every gap in his protection and threatening to slice through to the skin beneath. His feet scrambled for purchase on the loose desert surface as he threw himself forward, his entire body becoming a single instrument dedicated to the task of moving stone. Around him, his crewmates strained with equal desperation, their faces contorting with effort as they fought to overcome the massive inertia of their load. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. The limestone block sat motionless on its sledge, defying their collective effort with the indifference of geological time. Kheti could hear the ragged breathing of his crewmates, could smell the sharp scent of sweat and fear that always accompanied these first crucial moments of a transport run. This was the moment when injuries most often occurred, when overeager workers threw themselves too forcefully against the ropes and tore muscles, or when the sudden release of tension sent men sprawling onto the rocky ground. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, the sledge began to move. The movement was imperceptible at first. Just a slight shift in the stone's position that might have been imagined, but gradually, inevitably, the limestone block began its journey across the desert, creeping forward with painful slowness as 28 men bent their backs to a task that seemed to test the very limits of human endurance. The technique of stone hauling had been refined over years of construction, developed through trial and error by workers who had paid for their education with blood, sweat, and sometimes their lives. The key was coordination. Every man in the crew had to pull at precisely the same moment, with exactly the same effort, or the uneven force would cause the sledge to veer off course, or worse, to tip over and crush whoever was unfortunate enough to be in its path. The crew moved in response to a rhythmic chant called out by their gang leader, a simple, repetitive phrase that helped synchronize their efforts and maintain the steady pace that was essential for long-distance hauling. Heave and pull, and heave and pull. The words became a mantra that pushed everything else from their minds, reducing their existence to the simple alternation between effort and rest that would carry them through the long journey ahead. Kheti had learned to enter a kind of trance during these hauling sessions, a mental state that allowed him to endure the physical punishment while maintaining the focus necessary to coordinate with his crewmates. The pain in his shoulders and back became a background sensation, acknowledged but not dwelt upon. The burning in his lungs as he struggled to breathe in the dust-filled air was simply another fact of existence, no more worthy of attention than the heat of the sun or the roughness of the rope. The route from the quarry to the pyramid construction site was approximately half a mile, but the journey could take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours depending on the size of the stone, the condition of the path, and the countless variables that could complicate the transport process. The path itself was a carefully engineered roadway that had been graded and reinforced to handle the passage of heavy sledges. But even so, it presented numerous challenges that tested both the skill and endurance of the transport crews. The first major obstacle came less than 100 yards from the starting point, where the path descended into a shallow depression that had been carved by centuries of seasonal flooding. The downhill slope required careful control to prevent the sledge from gaining too much momentum and crushing the workers who were trying to guide it. Additional crew members positioned themselves at the sides and rear of the sledge, using control ropes to slow its descent and keep it on the proper path. The technique required split-second timing and absolute trust among all crew members. The men at the front continued to pull, but with reduced force to maintain control, while those at the sides and rear adjusted their efforts based on the sledge's behavior and the commands of the gang leader. A moment's inattention or a miscommunication could send several tons of limestone careening down the slope, potentially killing or maiming anyone in its path. Kheti had seen such accidents during his time at the construction site, and the memory of crushed bodies and screaming men was never far from his thoughts during these critical moments. The supervisors were quick to clear away casualties and get the work crews back to their tasks, but the psychological impact of these incidents lingered long after the physical evidence had been removed. Every worker knew that a single mistake could transform him from a living, breathing human being into a red stain on the desert sand. The depression passed without incident. But Kheti knew that more challenging obstacles lay ahead. The path wound its way through a landscape that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Rocky outcroppings that required careful navigation, patches of soft sand that could bog down a heavy sledge, and areas where the desert wind had carved small gullies that posed constant threats to unwary transport crews. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature began to rise to levels that transformed physical labor from merely difficult to genuinely dangerous. The desert heat was unlike anything that most of the workers had experienced in their home villages along the Nile, where the proximity of the river provided some relief from the worst of the summer temperatures. Here, with no shade and no water except for carefully rationed supplies, the heat became an enemy as dangerous as any physical obstacle. The human body was simply not designed to function under such conditions while performing heavy physical labor. Sweat poured from every pore, soaking through clothing, and creating a constant need for water that could never be fully satisfied. The workers' carefully rationed water supplies had to last for the entire working day, forcing them to ration their intake even as their bodies screamed for more fluid to replace what was being lost through perspiration. Kheti could feel his strength beginning to ebb as the morning progressed, the familiar signs of heat exhaustion creeping into his consciousness despite his years of experience with desert construction work. His vision occasionally flickered at the edges, and he had to concentrate to maintain his grip on the rope as his hands became slippery with sweat. Around him, his crewmates were showing similar signs of distress, their faces flushed and their breathing becoming increasingly labored. The gang leader, recognizing the signs of heat stress in his crew, called for a brief rest stop at a predetermined location where a small shelter had been constructed to provide temporary relief from the sun. The crew collapsed gratefully into the meager shade, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and their clothes completely soaked with perspiration. Water was distributed in carefully measured portions, just enough to wet their throats and provide a moment's relief without depleting their precious reserves. During these rest periods, the workers often spoke in quiet tones about the casualties they had witnessed or heard about from other crews. Heat stroke was a constant threat that could strike without warning, transforming a healthy worker into a delirious, convulsing victim within minutes. The supervisors had learned to recognize the early signs of heat-related illness, but their primary concern was maintaining productivity rather than worker safety, and men were often pushed beyond their physical limits in the name of meeting construction deadlines. The medical care available to workers who collapsed from heat exhaustion was primitive at best. Those who were still conscious might be moved to whatever shade was available and given water if supplies permitted. But there was little else that could be done. Workers who lost consciousness were often left where they fell, their fate depending on whether they recovered quickly enough to resume work or whether their condition deteriorated to the point where they were written off as casualties of the construction process. After the brief rest, the crew resumed their journey, the limestone block now seeming heavier than ever. As they struggled to regain their rhythm and coordination, the rope felt like it was cutting deeper into Kheti's shoulders, and he could feel new areas of chafing developing where his leather padding had shifted during the rest stop. But there was no choice except to continue. Abandoning a transport run meant facing the wrath of the supervisors and potentially losing his position in the work crew. The next major challenge came at the midpoint of the journey, where the path crossed a rocky ridge that required the sledge to be hauled up a steep incline. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire route, demanding maximum effort from the crew while simultaneously requiring precise control to prevent accidents. The technique involved positioning additional workers at strategic points along the sledge to help lift and guide the load while the main crew provided the primary pulling force. The climb up the ridge tested every aspect of the crew's training and experience. The footing was treacherous, with loose rocks that could shift unexpectedly under a worker's weight. The angle of the slope meant that the sledge was constantly threatening to slide backward, potentially crushing anyone who lost their grip on the control ropes. The physical effort required was enormous, demanding strength reserves that many workers simply didn't possess after hours of hauling in the desert heat. Kheti felt his legs trembling with effort as he fought to maintain his position on the slope, his muscles burning with the accumulated fatigue of the morning's work. Beside him, one of the newer workers was struggling visibly, his face pale despite the heat, and his movements becoming increasingly unsteady. The gang leader was shouting encouragement and commands, but his voice seemed to come from a great distance, as Kheti focused all his attention on the simple task of placing one foot in front of the other, while maintaining his grip on the rope. The moment of crisis came when they were 3/4 of the way up the slope, at the point where the incline was steepest and the footing most uncertain. The struggling worker beside Kheti suddenly stumbled, his foot sliding on a loose rock as he lost his balance and fell heavily to the ground. The sudden redistribution of weight along the rope caused the entire crew to lurch backward, and for a terrifying moment it seemed as though the sledge might break free and roll back down the slope. The gang leader's training saved them. His sharp commands cut through the confusion, directing specific workers to adjust their positions and compensate for the lost team member. The crew gradually regained control, though not before several men had been dragged backward across the rocky surface, leaving bloody scrapes and cuts as evidence of their struggle. The fallen worker was left where he lay, unconscious and possibly seriously injured, but the transport run had to continue. This was the harsh reality of pyramid construction. Individual workers were expendable resources whose value was measured solely by their ability to contribute to the project's progress. Stopping to provide aid to an injured crew member would delay the transport run and potentially prevent the crew from meeting their daily quota, leading to punishment for the entire group. The supervisors had made it clear that production targets took precedence over worker welfare, and the crews had learned to accept casualties as an unavoidable part of their work. The remainder of the climb passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion, with Kheti and his remaining crewmates pushing themselves beyond what they had thought were their physical limits. The summit of the ridge finally appeared above them, offering the promise of easier terrain ahead, but also revealing the daunting sight of the pyramid construction site spread out below them in all its chaotic complexity. From this elevated position, the scale of the construction project was overwhelming. Dozens of transport crews were visible at various points along the network of ramps and roadways that surrounded the pyramid, each crew hauling their own massive stone block toward the growing monument. The pyramid itself rose like a mountain from the desert floor, its geometric perfection a stark contrast to the apparent chaos of the construction activity surrounding it. But Kheti had little time to contemplate the impressive sight, as the crew now faced the challenge of controlling their sledge during the descent down the far side of the ridge. This required a completely different set of skills, as the workers had to act as a brake system to prevent the heavy load from accelerating beyond their ability to control. Ropes were repositioned, with some crew members moving to the rear of the sledge to provide resistance while others maintained their pulling positions to provide directional control. The descent was nerve-wracking but successful, bringing the crew to the final stretch of their journey across relatively level ground toward the pyramid construction site. Here, the path was wider and better maintained, allowing for faster progress despite the crew's accumulated exhaustion. Other transport crews were visible ahead and behind them, creating a steady stream of limestone blocks flowing toward the monument like some vast conveyor belt operated by human muscle power. As they approached the construction site itself, the noise and activity became overwhelming. Thousands of workers were engaged in various tasks related to pyramid construction. Stonemasons shaping blocks with copper chisels, engineers supervising the positioning of massive stones, and countless laborers hauling materials and performing the hundreds of support tasks that kept the project moving forward. The air was filled with dust and the constant sound of hammering, shouting, and the creaking of ropes and wooden machinery under strain. Kheti's crew was directed to a staging area, where finished limestone blocks were temporarily stored before being lifted into position on the pyramid itself. This was where their immediate responsibility ended, though they would likely be assigned to help with the lifting process once they had delivered their current load. The process of transferring the stone from the transport sledge to the lifting equipment required the same careful coordination that had characterized the entire journey, as any mistake at this stage could damage the block or injure the workers involved in the transfer. As the limestone block was finally positioned in the staging area and their immediate task was complete, Kheti allowed himself a moment to rest and assess his condition. His shoulders were raw where the rope had chafed despite his leather padding, and his entire body ached with the accumulated strain of the morning's work. His water supply was nearly exhausted, and he knew that the day was far from over. There would be more blocks to haul, more journeys across the punishing desert terrain, more tests of his ability to endure physical punishment that seemed designed to break the human spirit. But he had survived another transport run, and in the brutal mathematics of pyramid construction, survival was the only victory that mattered. The limestone block that he and his crew had hauled across the desert would become part of a monument that would endure for thousands of years. But none of the workers who had sacrificed their strength and health to move it would be remembered or honored for their contribution. They were anonymous participants in one of history's greatest construction projects, their individual suffering subsumed into the larger narrative of pharaonic power and divine ambition. The sun reached its merciless zenith, just as Kheti's crew completed their third stone transport of the day, and the heat had become a living thing that pressed down on the construction site with almost physical weight. The air shimmered with waves of superheated atmosphere that rose from the baking limestone blocks and sand, creating a hellish mirage that made distant objects dance and waver like ghosts. At this hour, when the temperature climbed to levels that could kill a man simply through exposure, even the most hardened supervisors acknowledged that some respite was necessary to prevent the complete collapse of the workforce. The call for the midday break came from the wooden horns that were positioned at strategic points around the construction site, their deep, mournful notes cutting through the constant din of construction activity. The sound was both a relief and a bitter reminder of how little time the workers would have to recover before the afternoon shift began. The break lasted exactly 1 hour, measured by the shadow cast by a specially positioned stone marker, and every minute of that time was precious beyond measure. Kheti stumbled toward the nearest shade structure, a crude pavilion constructed from wooden poles and woven palm fronds that provided minimal protection from the sun but represented the only refuge available to the transport crews. The structure was already crowded with workers from other gangs, their bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to escape the direct rays of the sun that could literally cook exposed flesh within minutes. The competition for shade was fierce but unspoken, governed by the same harsh hierarchy that structured every aspect of life at the construction site. The most experienced workers and those who had performed well during the morning shift claimed the spots with the best protection, while newer workers and those who had fallen out of favor with their supervisors were forced to make do with whatever marginal cover they could find. Kheti managed to secure a position near the edge of the pavilion, where a slight overhang provided some protection for his head and shoulders, while leaving the rest of his body exposed to the reflected heat from the surrounding sand. He immediately reached for his water skin, knowing that this might be his only opportunity to drink freely until the evening meal. The water was warm and had a brackish taste from the goat hide container, but it was still water, and he drank deeply despite the strict rationing that governed consumption throughout the working day. The water itself was a constant source of anxiety for the workers. The daily ration was barely sufficient under the best conditions, and the brutal heat of the construction site meant that men were constantly on the edge of dehydration. Those who worked too hard or sweated too much could find themselves in serious trouble, their bodies beginning to shut down as fluid levels dropped below critical thresholds. The supervisors were aware of this problem, but viewed it as just another variable to be managed rather than a humanitarian crisis requiring intervention. Around Kheti, his fellow workers were going through their own midday routines with the mechanical efficiency of men who had performed the same actions hundreds of times before. Some were tending to injuries sustained during the morning's work, using strips of cloth to bind cuts and scrapes or applying crude salves made from animal fat and herbs to areas where the ropes had chafed through their protective padding. The injuries were a constant concern that went far beyond the immediate pain and discomfort they caused. In an environment with no proper medical care and poor sanitary conditions, even minor cuts could become infected and lead to serious complications. Workers had learned to pay careful attention to any break in their skin, knowing that what seemed like a trivial injury could quickly develop into a life-threatening condition if not properly managed. Kheti examined his own shoulders, where the rope work had left a series of angry red marks, despite his leather padding. The skin was abraded, but not broken, though he knew that additional hauling sessions would likely worsen the damage. He adjusted his padding as best he could, trying to redistribute the pressure points that would be created when he resumed work in the afternoon. The food distributed during the midday break was even more meager than the morning ration, consisting of a small piece of bread and a handful of dried dates or figs when available. The bread was often stale and hard, requiring considerable effort to chew and swallow, especially when saliva production was reduced by dehydration. The dried fruit provided some energy and much-needed sweetness, but the portions were too small to have any significant impact on the workers' nutritional status. This minimal nutrition was one of the most insidious aspects of life at the construction site. The workers were performing enormously demanding physical labor that required substantial caloric intake to sustain, but they were fed at subsistence levels that left them constantly on the edge of malnutrition. Over time, this chronic undernourishment led to a gradual weakening of their bodies, making them more susceptible to injury and disease, while reducing their capacity for the very work they were required to perform. The supervisors understood this paradox, but viewed it as an acceptable trade-off in the economics of pyramid construction. Feeding the workers properly would have required enormous additional resources that could instead be devoted to other aspects of the project. The human cost of this decision was measured in shortened lifespans, chronic health problems, and reduced productivity. But these consequences were considered external to the immediate concerns of construction management. During the precious minutes of the midday break, conversations among the workers often turned to news from other parts of the construction site and updates on the progress of various work crews. Information flowed through informal networks that connected workers across different gangs and specialties, creating a communication system that the supervisors tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with productivity. The news was often grim. Reports of serious accidents, deaths from heat stroke or other causes, and increasingly difficult working conditions as the pyramid grew higher and more complex. The workers also shared information about which supervisors were particularly harsh or lenient, which work assignments were most dangerous, and which areas of the construction site offered slightly better conditions or opportunities for advancement. Kheti learned that morning that one of the transport crews working on the pyramid's eastern approach had lost 2 men in a single accident when their sledge had overturned while navigating a particularly difficult section of ramp. The details were sketchy, but it appeared that the crew had been pushing too hard to meet their quota when the accident occurred, crushing both workers instantly under the massive limestone block they had been hauling. Such incidents were becoming more common as the construction project progressed, and the pressure to maintain productivity increased. The pyramid was already behind schedule according to some estimates, and there were rumors that the pharaoh's advisors were growing impatient with the pace of construction. This pressure filtered down through the hierarchy of supervisors and gang leaders, ultimately falling on the individual workers who had to bear the physical and psychological burden of meeting increasingly demanding quotas. The social dynamics within the work crews were also evolving as the stress of the project took its toll on the men involved. Friendships that had formed during the early stages of construction were strained by the constant competition for resources and the pressure to maintain individual performance levels. Workers who had once supported each other were now more likely to view their colleagues as potential threats to their own survival and advancement. This erosion of solidarity was particularly evident during the midday break, when workers who might once have shared their meager rations now hoarded every scrap of food and drop of water for themselves. The supervisors encouraged this competitive atmosphere, believing that it drove higher performance levels. But the human cost was significant, as men who had to depend on each other for safety and survival found themselves increasingly isolated and suspicious. Kheti noticed these changes in his own crew, where the easy camaraderie of his first season had gradually given way to a more guarded and calculating approach to relationships. Men who had once joked and shared stories during breaks now sat in silence, conserving their energy and focusing on their own immediate needs. The loss of the crew member during the morning's transport run had only reinforced this tendency toward isolation, as each survivor was forced to confront the reality that any of them could be next. The physical toll of the work was becoming increasingly evident in the appearance and behavior of the workers. Men who had arrived at the construction site healthy and strong were now showing signs of premature aging, their bodies worn down by the constant stress of heavy labor in extreme conditions. Hair was turning gray, skin was becoming leathery and scarred, and the easy movement of youth was being replaced by the careful, measured gait of men who had learned to protect their damaged bodies from further injury. Kheti could see these changes in himself when he caught his reflection in pools of water or polished metal surfaces. His face had become gaunt and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the fettered sun and dust. His hands were scarred and calloused from rope work, and his shoulders had developed the characteristic stoop of men who spent their days bent under heavy loads. But perhaps the most disturbing changes were psychological rather than physical. The constant exposure to danger, the witness of accidents and deaths, and the relentless pressure to perform had begun to affect the mental state of many workers. Some became increasingly withdrawn and fatalistic, performing their duties with mechanical precision, but showing little interest in anything beyond their immediate survival. Others developed nervous tics or exhibited signs of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, jumping at sudden sounds or showing excessive anxiety about routine tasks. The supervisors were aware of these psychological effects but had little understanding of how to address them, beyond maintaining strict discipline and punishing any worker who failed to meet performance standards. The concept of mental health as distinct from physical health was not well developed in ancient Egyptian society, and workers who showed signs of psychological distress were often assumed to be malingering or possessed by evil spirits. As the midday break drew to a close, signaled by the shadows cast by the stone markers, the workers began the process of preparing for the afternoon shift. This was often the most difficult part of the working day, as the sun was at its peak intensity and the accumulated fatigue from the morning's labor made every task more challenging. The afternoon shift typically lasted until the sun was well past its zenith, and the shadows began to lengthen, providing some relief from the worst heat. The work assignments for the afternoon were distributed by the gang leaders, who had to balance the need to maintain productivity with the reality of their crew's declining physical condition. Workers who had performed well during the morning might be given slightly easier tasks, while those who had struggled might be assigned to more demanding work as a form of punishment or motivation. Kheti was assigned to another transport run, this time hauling a slightly smaller block over a route that was considered less challenging than the morning's assignment. This was both a relief and a reminder of his status within the crew hierarchy. He was experienced enough to be trusted with important work, but not senior enough to be given the easier supervisory roles that came with advancement within the construction organization. The afternoon transport run began much like the morning sessions, with the crew assembling around their assigned sledge and checking their equipment before beginning the process of moving the limestone block. But the accumulated effects of heat, fatigue, and dehydration made every aspect of the work more difficult. Ropes that had felt manageable in the morning now seemed heavier and more unwieldy. Footing that had been secure earlier in the day now felt uncertain and treacherous. The crew's coordination, which had been smooth and efficient during their first transport runs, began to show signs of strain as individual workers struggled to maintain their focus and timing. Commands from the gang leader had to be repeated more frequently, and the rhythm of the work became increasingly irregular, as different crew members responded at different speeds to direction and signals. The heat was becoming unbearable, with the afternoon sun beating down on the construction site with an intensity that seemed to drain the life from everything it touched. The limestone blocks themselves were now too hot to touch with bare skin, requiring workers to use cloth wrapping or wooden tools to handle them safely. The metal components of their equipment, buckles, rings, and fasteners, became burning hot and could cause serious burns if they came into contact with exposed skin. Water discipline became even more critical during the afternoon shift, as the temptation to drink freely from rapidly depleting supplies had to be balanced against the need to conserve resources for the remainder of the working day. Workers who had been careless with their water consumption during the morning often found themselves facing serious dehydration by mid-afternoon, leading to reduced performance and increased risk of heat-related illness. The afternoon transport run took nearly twice as long as the morning sessions, partly due to the more cautious pace required by the extreme conditions, and partly due to the crew's declining physical condition. Rest stops became more frequent and longer, as workers needed additional time to recover from even modest exertions. The gang leader, recognizing the signs of heat exhaustion in his crew, was forced to balance the need to maintain progress with the risk of losing workers to collapse or injury. By the time the crew completed their afternoon transport run and delivered their limestone block to the construction site, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, providing the first hint of relief from the day's brutal heat. But there were still hours of work remaining before the day shift would end, and Kheti knew that the most dangerous part of the day might still lie ahead. The late afternoon hours were when most serious accidents occurred, as exhausted workers made mistakes that could prove fatal in the unforgiving environment of pyramid construction. Attention wandered, reflexes slowed, and the careful coordination that was essential for safe operation of heavy equipment began to break down. The supervisors were aware of this pattern but had little choice except to continue pushing their crews toward the daily quotas that determined whether the construction project stayed on schedule. As Kheti prepared for what might be his final transport run of the day, he tried to assess his own condition and determine whether he had the strength and focus necessary to complete the work safely. His body was already pushed beyond what he had thought were his limits, and he knew that the margin for error was growing smaller with each passing hour. But stopping was not an option. The consequences of failing to meet his assigned quota would be severe, and there were no alternatives except to continue working until the day shift finally ended. The afternoon was far from over, and the pyramid continued its silent demand for more stone, more labor, more human sacrifice in the service of pharaonic ambition. The sun blazed overhead like an angry god, and somewhere in the distance, another worker collapsed from heat exhaustion, his body adding to the toll that the monument would exact before its completion. The signal to end the day shift came as the sun hung low on the western horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and gold that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. For the pyramid workers, however, the approaching sunset represented nothing more than survival. Another day endured, another night of rest earned through suffering. The wooden horns that marked the end of work echoed across the construction site, with a tone that seemed to carry the exhaustion of 20,000 men, each one pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. Kheti stood swaying on his feet as the final transport run of the day came to an end. His limestone block delivered to the staging area where it would wait for the next phase of construction. His body had moved beyond simple fatigue into a state of complete depletion that left him feeling disconnected from his physical form, as though he were observing his own suffering from a great distance. The rope burns on his shoulders had worsened throughout the afternoon, and he could feel fresh blood seeping through his leather padding where the constant friction had finally worn through his skin. Around him, the other members of his transport crew were in similar condition, their faces blank with exhaustion and their movements reduced to the minimum necessary to remain upright. 2 men from their original crew of 28 had not survived the day. One had collapsed from heat stroke during the afternoon shift and been carried away by the medical attendants, while another had been crushed when a sledge had overturned during a particularly difficult section of the return journey. The surviving crew members had learned not to dwell on such losses, understanding that grief was a luxury they couldn't afford in an environment where survival required complete focus on immediate needs. The process of organizing the return journey to the workers' village began immediately after the work horns sounded, with gang leaders moving through their crews to account for survivors and assign transportation duties for equipment and injured workers. The tools and ropes that had been distributed in the morning had to be collected and returned to storage facilities, both to prevent theft and to ensure that they would be available for the next day's work. This seemingly simple task was complicated by the fact that many workers were barely capable of carrying themselves, let alone additional equipment. Kheti gathered his rope and leather padding with movements that felt sluggish and uncoordinated, his hands shaking with fatigue as he struggled to roll the heavy cord into a manageable bundle. The rope was stained with his blood and sweat, and its rough fibers had become embedded with sand and limestone dust that would need to be cleaned out before it could be used again. The leather padding was in even worse condition, torn and saturated with bodily fluids that had attracted swarms of flies during the hottest parts of the day. The march back to the workers' village was a grim procession that bore little resemblance to the organized efficiency of the morning departure. Workers stumbled along the desert paths in loose groups, many supporting injured comrades who could no longer walk unassisted. The careful formation and timing that had characterized the outbound journey had given way to a more desperate migration, with each man focused primarily on reaching the relative safety of the village before complete physical collapse made further movement impossible. The path that had seemed challenging but manageable in the cool morning air now presented obstacles that appeared almost insurmountable to the exhausted workers. Rocky sections that had required careful footing in the morning now claimed additional casualties as men with depleted reflexes lost their balance and fell onto the unforgiving stone surfaces. The gentle slopes that had barely been noticed during the outbound journey now felt like mountains that had to be climbed through sheer force of will. Kheti found himself part of an informal support group that had formed around 3 workers who were having particular difficulty with the return journey. One man was suffering from what appeared to be severe dehydration, his skin flushed and dry despite the heat, while another was limping badly from an injury sustained when a rope had snapped under tension and sent him sprawling onto sharp rocks. The third was simply exhausted beyond his ability to function, his legs trembling with each step as he fought to remain conscious. The unspoken code that governed such situations was complex and sometimes contradictory. Workers were expected to help their comrades when possible, both out of basic human decency and because they might need similar assistance themselves in the future. But this obligation had to be balanced against the need for self-preservation. in an environment where showing weakness could lead to punishment or assignment to even more dangerous work. Men who became known as frequent supporters of struggling workers sometimes found themselves targeted by supervisors who viewed such behavior as a sign of insufficient dedication to the project. The supervisors themselves were dealing with their own version of exhaustion, though their day had been less physically demanding than that of the ordinary workers. Their responsibility for maintaining discipline and productivity among thousands of men under extreme conditions created psychological stress that was different from but no less debilitating than the physical punishment endured by the laborers. Many supervisors had started their careers as workers themselves and understood the suffering they were required to inflict, creating internal conflicts that some resolved by becoming even more harsh in their treatment of subordinates. The evening air provided some relief from the day's heat, but the temperature was still uncomfortably warm and would remain so until well after sunset. The workers' clothing, which had been soaked with sweat for most of the day, now felt clammy and uncomfortable as evaporation began to cool their overheated bodies. The rapid temperature change, combined with dehydration and exhaustion, left many men shivering despite the ongoing heat, their bodies' temperature regulation systems overwhelmed by the day's abuse. The sight of the workers' village appearing in the distance was both a relief and a reminder of how basic their living conditions were compared to the grand ambitions of the pyramid project. The neat rows of mud brick structures looked almost welcoming after a day spent in the open desert, but Kheti knew that the village offered only the most minimal comforts: cramped sleeping quarters, inadequate food, and little protection from the elements beyond what was absolutely necessary to keep the workforce functional. The evening meal distribution began as soon as the first workers reached the village, with supervisors organizing the process to handle the thousands of men who would be arriving over the next hour. The food was the same basic fare that had been provided at midday: bread, onions, and beer, but the portions were slightly larger to help workers recover from the day's exertions and prepare for another day of labor. The quality of the food varied considerably depending on when it had been prepared and how long it had been sitting in the heat, with early arrivals generally receiving fresher and more palatable rations. Kheti's turn in the food line came after a wait that felt interminable to his famished body, though it probably lasted no more than 20 minutes. The bread was stale but edible, and the onions provided some relief from the taste of dust and limestone that had coated his mouth throughout the day. The beer was warm and slightly sour, but it represented precious fluid that his dehydrated body desperately needed. He ate slowly, knowing that consuming the food too quickly could lead to stomach problems that would make the next day's work even more difficult. The evening meal was one of the few times during the day when workers could engage in something approaching normal social interaction, though conversations were often subdued due to exhaustion and the constant awareness that supervisors were monitoring their behavior. News and gossip circulated through the groups of eating workers, providing updates on conditions in different parts of the construction site and information about workers who had been injured or killed during the day's operations. The casualty reports from the day's work were sobering. In addition to the deaths that Kheti had witnessed personally, there had been numerous other serious accidents across the construction site. A stonemason had been killed when a block had shifted unexpectedly while he was shaping it, crushing his chest before he could move clear. A member of one of the lifting crews had fallen from a height while positioning a block on the pyramid, his body broken on the limestone below. Several workers had collapsed from heat stroke and been removed from the site, though whether they would recover was uncertain. These reports were received with the grim acceptance of men who had learned to view death as a routine aspect of their work environment. The supervisors made no attempt to hide or minimize the casualties, understanding that workers needed to be aware of the dangers they faced in order to take appropriate precautions. But neither was there any formal recognition of the losses or support for workers who were struggling with the psychological impact of witnessing frequent deaths and injuries. The medical care available in the workers' village was limited but better than nothing, consisting mainly of a few experienced healers who had learned to treat the most common injuries and illnesses associated with construction work. These men operated out of a designated area near the village center, using whatever supplies they could obtain to provide basic treatment for cuts, bruises, heat exhaustion, and other routine problems. Kheti made his way to the medical area. After finishing his evening meal, hoping to get some treatment for the rope burns on his shoulders before they became infected. The healer who examined him was a middle-aged man named Sineb, who had worked on construction projects for most of his adult life before an injury had forced him into his current role. Sineb's examination was quick but thorough, his experienced hands immediately identifying the areas where the rope had worn through the leather padding and into the skin beneath. The treatment consisted of cleaning the wounds with water that had been boiled earlier in the day, then applying a salve made from animal fat mixed with crushed herbs that were believed to have healing properties. The salve provided some immediate relief from the burning sensation, and Sineb wrapped the treated areas with strips of clean cloth that would help protect them from further irritation. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, but it represented one of the few instances during the day when Kheti had received care and attention focused on his well-being rather than his productivity. The healer's advice was simple but important. Try to adjust the leather padding to distribute the pressure more evenly. Drink as much water as possible during the evening to help the body recover from dehydration, and avoid sleeping on the injured areas if possible. All of this advice was easier to give than to follow in the cramped conditions of the workers' shelters. But Kheti understood that the healer was doing his best with the limited resources available to him. The evening hours in the workers' village had a different character from the rest of the day, with the harsh discipline of the work site giving way to a more relaxed atmosphere, where workers could attend to personal needs and social relationships. Men gathered in small groups around cooking fires, sharing whatever additional food they had been able to obtain through trade or special assignments. Some engaged in simple games using dice carved from bone or stones arranged in patterns that required strategy and skill. Others used the time to maintain their equipment, cleaning tools and repairing clothing and padding that had been damaged during the day's work. This maintenance was essential for survival, as workers who reported for duty with inadequate equipment were likely to be assigned to the most dangerous tasks or punished for being unprepared. The quality of a worker's tools and protective gear could literally mean the difference between life and death in the harsh environment of pyramid construction. Kheti spent some time adjusting his leather padding based on the healer's recommendations, using a bone needle to create new attachment points that would distribute the rope's pressure across a wider area of his shoulders and back. The work was tedious and required concentration that was difficult to maintain given his exhaustion, but he understood that taking the time to make these adjustments now could prevent more serious injuries in the future. The social dynamics of the evening hours revealed aspects of the workers' personalities and relationships that were suppressed during the demanding work periods. Men who had seemed harsh and competitive during the day sometimes showed unexpected kindness in sharing food or helping with equipment repairs. Others who had appeared friendly and cooperative during work proved to be selfish and calculating when resources were scarce and supervision was relaxed. Kheti found himself drawn into a conversation with workers from other gangs, who were comparing conditions on different parts of the construction site. The consensus was that all areas of the project were becoming more dangerous and demanding as pressure increased to maintain construction schedules. Some sections of the pyramid had been experiencing particular problems with equipment failures and accidents, leading to rumors that the project might be falling behind schedule despite the enormous human costs being paid to keep it moving forward. The conversation also revealed the complex web of informal relationships and obligations that helped workers survive in the harsh environment of the construction site. Information about safer work assignments, better supervisors, and opportunities for advancement was shared among trusted colleagues, while warnings about dangerous conditions and harsh treatment were passed along through networks of mutual support. These relationships were essential for survival, but they also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by supervisors seeking to maintain control over the workforce. As full darkness settled over the workers' village, The activities gradually wound down as exhausted men prepared for the few hours of rest that would have to sustain them through another day of labor. The cooking fires were banked or extinguished, tools and equipment were secured against theft, and workers began making their way to their sleeping quarters with the slow, careful movements of people whose bodies had been pushed beyond their normal limits. The night sounds of the village were a mixture of human suffering and the occasional comfort of community. Men coughed and groaned in their sleep, their damaged lungs and overworked muscles protesting even during rest. Others talked quietly or snored, providing a background murmur that was somehow reassuring in its proof that life continued despite the day's hardships. Occasionally someone would cry out from a nightmare or wake with a start, the psychological toll of the work manifesting in disturbed sleep patterns that prevented proper rest. Kheti settled onto his reed mat in the cramped shelter he shared with 5 other workers, trying to find a position that wouldn't put pressure on his injured shoulders, while still allowing some rest for his aching back and legs. The space was barely large enough for the 6 men, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the lingering odors of the day's work. But it was shelter, and it was rest, and for workers whose lives had been reduced to the basic necessities of survival, that was enough. Sleep, when it finally came, was often troubled by dreams that reflected the day's experiences and fears about what tomorrow might bring. Many workers reported recurring nightmares about being crushed by falling stones, lost in the desert, or trapped in collapsed tunnels. Others dreamed of home and family, memories that provided some comfort, but also reminded them of what they had sacrificed to work on the pyramid project. The night also brought its own dangers and challenges. Workers who had been injured during the day sometimes developed complications that required attention, but medical care was limited during nighttime hours. Those suffering from severe dehydration or heat stroke might continue to deteriorate despite being out of the sun, and there were always men who simply didn't wake up in the morning, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated stress and damage of pyramid construction work. As Kheti lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the village settling down for the night, he tried not to think about the next day and the renewed cycle of suffering that would begin before dawn. Instead, he focused on the simple fact that he had survived another day, that his body was still functional despite the punishment it had endured, and that he would have a few hours of rest before having to face the pyramid's demands once again. The pyramid itself was invisible in the darkness, but its presence dominated the landscape and the thoughts of everyone in the workers' village. It represented both the purpose that gave meaning to their suffering and the remorseless force that consumed human lives without regard for individual hopes, dreams, or fears. Tomorrow would bring another day of service to its construction, another test of endurance and survival, another step closer to completion of a monument that would outlast all of its builders by millennia. 3 years had passed since Kheti first arrived at the pyramid construction site as a young farmer seeking work during the flood season, and the boy who had once dreamed of earning enough to buy better tools for his family's fields was gone forever. In his place stood a man aged beyond his years, his body marked by the systematic destruction that pyramid construction inflicted on those who built it. His shoulders were permanently stooped from years of hauling massive stones. His hands were gnarled and scarred from rope work, and his lungs wheezed with every breath as limestone dust had gradually destroyed their ability to function properly. The seasonal rhythm that governed pyramid construction had become the defining structure of Kheti's existence, a cycle of departure and return that marked time more reliably than the flooding of the Nile or the movement of the stars. Each year, as the flood waters began to recede from the farmlands along the river, thousands of men would make the journey to the pyramid site, drawn by the promise of work and wages that could supplement their agricultural income. And each year, fewer would return home, their places taken by a new generation of workers who had not yet learned what the pyramid would demand of them. For Kheti, The decision to return for a fourth season had not been a choice in any meaningful sense. His body was no longer capable of the intensive agricultural work that had once been his livelihood, and the small payment he received for each season of pyramid construction had become essential for his family's survival. The irony was bitter but undeniable. The work that was destroying his health had also made him dependent on continuing that same work, trapping him in a cycle that could only end with his death or complete incapacitation. The pyramid itself had grown dramatically during Kheti's time at the construction site, rising from a massive but incomplete structure to something that was beginning to resemble the monument that its architects had envisioned. The base was now completely finished, a perfect square covering more than 13 acres, with stones fitted together so precisely that it was impossible to slide a knife blade between them. The first 40 courses of stone had been completed, creating a pyramid that already towered above everything else in the landscape and cast shadows that could be seen for miles across the desert. But the work was becoming progressively more difficult and dangerous as the pyramid grew higher. The ramps and pathways that allowed workers to transport stones to the upper levels were longer and steeper than ever before, requiring enormous effort to haul even modest-sized blocks to their final positions. The lifting mechanisms needed to position stones at height were more complex and prone to failure, leading to accidents that could kill or maim multiple workers when equipment broke under the enormous stresses involved. Kheti had been assigned to one of the high-level transport crews during his fourth season, a promotion that reflected his experience and survival skills, but also placed him in one of the most dangerous positions on the entire construction site. The crew was responsible for moving stones up the main ramp system to heights of more than 100 feet above the desert floor, where they would be positioned by specialized lifting teams using a combination of levers, ramps, and wooden machinery that pushed the limits of ancient engineering. The physical demands of high-level transport work were staggering. The ramps were inclined at angles that required maximum effort just to maintain footing, let alone haul multi-ton loads up their length. The higher altitude meant that workers were more exposed to wind and weather, and the constant fear of falling created psychological stress that was as debilitating as the physical punishment. Workers who lost their grip on ropes or equipment could fall to their deaths, and the confined space of the ramps meant that accidents often involved multiple casualties as falling men or equipment struck others below them. The view from the upper levels of the pyramid was both magnificent and terrifying, offering a perspective on the construction project that few workers ever experienced. From this height, the scale of human activity below was overwhelming. Thousands of workers moving like ants across the desert floor. Transport crews hauling stones along the network of ramps and pathways, and support personnel performing the countless tasks necessary to keep the project functioning. The workers' village was visible in the distance, a geometric pattern of mud brick structures that housed the army of laborers whose lives were being consumed in service to pharaonic ambition. But the view also revealed the true cost of pyramid construction in human terms. The desert around the monument was dotted with burial sites where workers who had died during construction were interred in simple graves marked only by rough stone markers. The number of these graves had grown steadily during Kheti's time at the site, creating small cemeteries that served as grim reminders of the price being paid for each course of stone that was added to the pyramid's height. The social dynamics among the workers had evolved significantly as the project progressed and the physical and psychological toll mounted. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the early stages of construction had given way to a more desperate and competitive atmosphere, where survival often depended on outperforming colleagues and avoiding assignment to the most dangerous tasks. Friendships that had formed during shared suffering could dissolve quickly when resources became scarce or when one worker's advancement came at another's expense. Kheti had learned to navigate these treacherous social waters with the skill of someone whose life depended on reading human nature accurately. He maintained cordial relationships with his fellow workers while avoiding the deeper connections that could become liabilities in an environment where today's friend might be tomorrow's competition for a safer work assignment. The emotional cost of this isolation was significant, but it was preferable to the alternative of being exploited or betrayed by men who were fighting for their own survival. The pyramid's construction schedule had become increasingly aggressive as the project entered its later phases, with supervisors pushing workers harder than ever to meet deadlines that seemed to be based more on political considerations than engineering realities. Rumors circulated that the pharaoh was growing impatient with the pace of construction and that heads would roll if the monument was not completed according to the original timeline. This pressure filtered down through every level of the hierarchy, ultimately falling on individual workers who had to meet quotas that required them to risk their lives on a daily basis. The technological challenges of pyramid construction had also become more complex as the structure grew higher, and the engineering problems more difficult. The simple techniques that had been adequate for the lower courses of stone were no longer sufficient for the precise work required at greater heights, where even small errors could compromise the structural integrity of the entire monument. New methods had to be developed and tested, often using workers as experimental subjects in procedures that carried significant risks of injury or death. Kheti had witnessed several of these experimental procedures firsthand, including attempts to use counterweight systems to lift particularly heavy stones and trials of new rope configurations designed to provide better control during transport operations. The workers involved in these experiments understood that they were serving as test subjects, but they had little choice except to comply with orders from supervisors who viewed innovation as essential to meet construction deadlines. The medical consequences of pyramid construction work were becoming increasingly evident as workers who had survived multiple seasons began to show signs of chronic health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Respiratory diseases caused by limestone dust inhalation were nearly universal among long-term workers, leading to persistent coughs, shortness of breath, and gradual reduction in physical capacity. Joint problems from repeated heavy lifting and rope work created chronic pain that made normal movement difficult even during rest periods. Kheti's own health had deteriorated steadily during his time at the construction site, and he was acutely aware that his body was failing in ways that would make normal life increasingly difficult. His back pain had become constant and severe, making it hard to find comfortable sleeping positions even when he was exhausted from the day's work. His hands shook with a tremor that made fine motor tasks difficult, and his vision had begun to blur occasionally, possibly due to the effects of chronic dehydration and heat exposure. The psychological toll was equally significant, though less visible to supervisors and medical attendants who focused primarily on workers' ability to perform their assigned tasks. Many long-term workers developed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, including persistent nightmares, anxiety attacks, and an inability to form normal social relationships. The constant exposure to death and injury, combined with the knowledge that their own survival was never guaranteed, created mental health problems that the ancient world had no framework for understanding or treating. Sleep disorders were common among workers who had survived multiple construction seasons, with many men finding it impossible to achieve the deep, restorative sleep that their bodies desperately needed. The cramped conditions in the workers' shelters made restful sleep difficult under the best circumstances, but the psychological effects of the work created additional barriers to proper rest. Workers often reported lying awake for hours despite being physically exhausted, their minds racing with anxiety about the next day's assignments or replaying traumatic incidents from previous work shifts. The economic incentives that had originally drawn workers to the pyramid project had proven to be largely illusory for most participants. The wages paid for construction work were minimal, barely sufficient to compensate for the income lost by leaving agricultural work during the flood season. The real compensation came in the form of food and shelter provided during the construction period, but this represented subsistence rather than advancement. Few workers were able to accumulate significant savings or improve their economic status through pyramid construction work. For workers like Kheti, who had become trapped in the cycle of returning for multiple seasons, the economic situation was even more. Their damaged health made it difficult or impossible to return to their original occupations, while their specialized knowledge of construction work had little value outside the pyramid project. They found themselves dependent on continued employment in an industry that was slowly killing them, with few alternatives available for supporting themselves or their families. The families of pyramid workers also paid a significant price for their relatives' involvement in the construction project. Men who returned home after seasons of brutal labor were often physically and emotionally changed in ways that made it difficult to resume normal family relationships. Chronic pain, disability, and psychological trauma created barriers to intimacy and communication that could persist long after the construction work had ended. Some workers never returned home at all. Their deaths at the construction site, leaving their families without support or even reliable information about what had happened to their loved ones. The notification systems for worker casualties were informal and unreliable, with families sometimes waiting months or years for news about men who had died early in a construction season. The economic impact on these families could be devastating, particularly for women and children who had few resources available to support themselves without male relatives. The pyramid project itself was approaching completion during Kheti's 4th season, though the final phases of construction would require several more years of work by thousands of additional workers. The monument that was emerging from the desert floor was undeniably magnificent, a testament to human ambition and engineering skill that would endure for millennia. But the human cost had been staggering, measured not just in the lives lost during construction, but in the countless workers whose health and futures had been sacrificed to create something that would primarily serve to glorify a single individual. As Kheti looked up at the growing pyramid during his rest breaks, he tried to find some meaning in the suffering he had endured and witnessed. The monument would outlast every person involved in its construction, carrying their collective effort into a future that none of them would live to see. In some sense, this represented a form of immortality, a way for ordinary men to participate in something that transcended the normal limitations of human life and achievement. But the immortality was anonymous and abstract, offering little comfort to workers whose daily reality was dominated by pain, fear, and the constant threat of death or injury. The individual stories of courage, suffering, and sacrifice that filled every day of pyramid construction would be forgotten long before the stones themselves crumbled, leaving only the monument itself as evidence of what thousands of men had endured to create it. The seasonal rhythm that had structured Kheti's life for 4 years was beginning to break down as his body approached the limits of what it could endure. He knew that he might not survive another full season of construction work, and he had begun to make plans for a life that would be shaped primarily by disability and chronic illness. The irony was that his years of pyramid construction had given him knowledge and skills that could potentially be valuable in other contexts, but his damaged health made it unlikely that he would ever have the opportunity to use them. As his 4th season drew to a close, and the time came to return to his home village, Kheti packed his few possessions with the careful movements of someone whose body protested every action. The pyramid rose behind him, its angular form stark against the evening sky, already dwarfing everything else in the landscape and promising to grow even larger in the years to come. He had played his part in creating something that would endure long after his own death, but the personal cost had been everything he had to give. The journey home was difficult, with many workers struggling to cover the distance between the construction site and their villages along the Nile. Some would not complete the journey, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of multiple construction seasons. Others would arrive home so changed by their experiences that their families would struggle to recognize them. A few would recover enough to attempt normal agricultural work, though their reduced capacity would limit their economic prospects for the rest of their lives. Kheti understood that he was unlikely to return for a fifth season, though the decision would ultimately be made by circumstances beyond his control. If his family's economic situation became desperate enough, or if his health stabilized sufficiently to allow continued work, he might find himself making the familiar journey back to the pyramid site when the floodwaters receded the following year. But he also knew that each season might be his last, and he tried to find some satisfaction in the knowledge that he had contributed to creating something that would outlast all of his contemporaries. The pyramid would eventually be completed by other workers whose stories would be equally anonymous and whose sacrifices would be equally forgotten by history. The monument would stand as a testament to human achievement and divine ambition, but it would also serve as a memorial to the thousands of men who had given their lives, their health, and their futures to create it. They had built something eternal from the raw materials of human suffering, and in doing so they had achieved a form of immortality that was as magnificent as it was tragic. As the construction site disappeared behind him and the familiar landscape of the Nile Valley appeared ahead, Kheti allowed himself to imagine a future that was not dominated by limestone blocks and transport ropes. It would not be an easy future, given his damaged health and limited economic prospects, but it would be his own in a way that the pyramid construction site had never allowed. He had survived what many had not, and he carried with him the knowledge that he had participated in creating one of the wonders of the ancient world, even if that participation had cost him almost everything he had to give.